for the sake of time. So first of all, thank you, Ali, for being a presenter of the day here at Senya. So I actually first met Ali, I think, online at one of Matt Nasser's, a colleague from Brown, from his lab meetings. And then we met a second time eating a burrito in between sessions at RLDM. and yeah, I remember that too. And yeah, so Ali is a postdoc in Robert Yang's lab. At that time, he was a postdoc in Mike Halassa's lab, and he was doing work that I think is just fascinating and super interesting. And also, obviously, because I'm a bit biased on this, but it's in the interaction between neuroscience and AI, of course. But Ali has the particularity that it's really towards the AI goal, which I think is very interesting for us in the center, and also very similar to the things we've been working on during my postdoc at the time at Brown, which is sort of gating mechanism from basal ganglia and so forth, and understanding as well what type of mechanisms could help for smarter AI algorithms. And so without further ado, Ali, again, thank you for being the speaker of today, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Christian. It's been a pleasure knowing you, and thank you for the invite. Thanks everybody for having me. I will describe this this model that kind of how to learn abstractions from a stream of experience, inspired by cognitive science and neuroscience. So I'll be talking about a variety of things. So feel free to ask any questions and stop me at any time. I have one particular mechanism, one different way of using backpropagation that might be difficult for me to explain. So feel free to interrupt me at any time and ask questions. The main thrust behind my work is humans have this elaborate cognition and abstractions, and we describe the world in specific terms, and we have concepts and categories and ways how we categorize things. But then the question is, how do we learn this from experience? So as babies interact with the world, or a neural network powering an RL agent, for example, interacting with the environment, what you see as a learner is in any domain of learning, supervised. I'll be working on supervised mainly, so I'll just talk about that specifically. Is you get a pair of inputs and outputs, and some computation you have to do or learn how to transform this input to the output. So you get a stream of these throughout your training, and it's really up to you to find any possibly useful abstractions. Maybe you want to divide them into tasks. Maybe some tasks share some similarities. And these abstractions could really help you learn the mapping you're asked to do between inputs and outputs. And this kind of, we're just creating now some cognitive structure where I have the mapping from input to output, but I also have some abstraction over it that gates it or governs it or decides amongst possible computations that I could perform at any given moment in time. So these structures have quite a long literature in cognitive science, and to kind of narrow it down to concretely what cognitive scientists have imagined and worked on, we can imagine the Stroop test, for example, that many people are familiar with. In some situations, in some contexts in this task, you're asked to read the word, what would the letters say, or to name the color of the ink. And the experiment will alternate between the two. Here, the experimenter is even kind enough and will tell you which rule you're in. Are you supposed to read the word or name the color? And of course, the input is the same in both situations. So if you're just following the input of each word, you wouldn't be able to do this. You have to pay attention to context. How cognitive scientists imagine this is implemented in the mind and eventually the brain is that you go from some input layer here at the bottom. You have some intermediate processing, layers of processing, and then you have your output or verbal response here. And the way you switch between those two tasks is you have some control representation in the prefrontal cortex here, and you have a node that stands for color, and one stands for reading the words. And then depending on which what task you believe you're asked to do, you can quickly and efficiently switch between those two representations. When you activate color, it'll project to the right computational elements, and it'll switch your computations to that task. So this has many connections to several fields, and I'm want to kind of make those connections early on and not exclude other. Context is you like, what are those abstractions? What are they? Are they different contexts as in neuroscience, tasks in machine learning, concepts in cognitive science, abstractions? Are they skills? So even in RL agents, they are asked to deploy multiple skills possibly, and to switch between them to explore the environment or to perform new tasks. So it has many connections to many disciplines. And building this architecture is beneficial. Cognitive science has all kinds of promises as to why organizing computations in this way would be beneficial, especially if we contrast it to the typical machine learning paradigm, where we have very rich abstractions, Z, but they are mainly coming from the input, and your responses are accordingly dependent on the input. You don't have an independent Z that you can manipulate to specify your computations. Whatever is in your input, you will have to respond to it. If you are from the same input supposed to respond differently, the only way for you to adapt to that is to change the parameters of the neural network, for example, to switch what computation you're doing. And we're contrasting that with this cognitive control structure where Z is independent of the input it's coming from elsewhere. This structure is cognitive psychology promises says it will provide us with an adaptive and flexible behavior. So we are now able to adapt our behavior dynamically by just changing Z. We're not changing anything in our parameters. We're not changing the synaptic weights. We're just changing Z. Also, if Z is, for example, a vector of values, we could possibly compose this vector or find values in this vector space to generalize to solve new problems by recombining our previous representations. It also speeds learning because, and the intuition is that if you cut up the world down the right abstractions and the right dimensions, then you will not need as much data to learn this massive computational space because you broke it down meaningfully, and now you need less data to learn a specific situation. These benefits have been shown in humans, but then the question becomes is, how do we build these? How do we design a neural network or a learning agent that can discover these useful abstractions and use them to get these benefits? That has not been specified in cognitive science, and that's kind of the question that this work goes after. I will not belabor this, but this is kind of how I imagine this maps to the brain. There's the thalamus is a relatively older area in the brain, kind of a small nucleus right in the middle of the brain. And we believe that most advanced cognition happens in the cortex of the brain, this really massive sheet. It's the largest organ in the brain, and a lot of advanced cognition happens here. But the brain is kind of interestingly receives all of the inputs from the outside world, has to go through the thalamus, and then kind of projects to the various areas in the brain, and then those areas project back to the thalamus. So it's a bit of an interesting hub right in the middle of the brain that seems to have a special function to match its interesting structure. So to not spend too much time on this, the experiments from neuroscience shows like that if you're in a context 1 versus the experimenters switch you to context 2, then that can be decoded from the mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus. Then, so it does seem to be basically mapping to a computational structure like this, where the thalamus has a low dimensional embedding of what is the current context the animal believes they're in. In other words, kind of what task the animal believes that they're solving right now. And this acts to modulate the neural network that computes from input to produce the output. So this is kind of inspired from these circuits in the brain, and then leads to this computational structure. But again, the question also remains is how does the brain decide these things that we're gonna abstract the task? How does the animal discover task context and learn to represent it in the MD and modulate its computations? How is this built from experience? So to tackle that question, I'm gonna assume that we have some stream of computations. We don't have this abstraction into tasks, and we want to learn it from experience. So for that, I can kind of condense it to 3 necessary ingredients. One is learning, and I'm going to define learning as updating the neural network parameters and the brain changes in synapses between neurons. I need another piece now. If I say there's a Z that abstracts over tasks, then I need a mechanism to infer this Z. What is the appropriate Z for the current computations that are asked of me? And I further need a specific kind of inference mechanism that is able to, if I labeled previously learned tasks with some vector Z, I need to be able to retrieve those previously stored tasks. I also would like it to compose new solutions to new tasks based on those previous tasks learned. And if it's a new task, I would like for it to also create a new label for this task. So this inference mechanism will be a big part, and I will kind of take the time to take it up or kind of take it apart a bit and discuss its components. A third mechanism that is necessary is some change point detection algorithm. So I need to have some sense of when the world has changed and when should I be suspecting that this is a different task. And I will show why this is necessary later. So with these 3 components, I think the one that is kind of difficult to explain for me is the inference mechanism. So I think I'll do this in 2 stages. Well, in the first stage, I'll just focus on the inference mechanism and how that part work. So our goal is to eventually learn from a stream of experience, which is stage 2, no task IDs or boundaries ever provided. But I'll start off with a stage 1 where I do get task IDs and task times during training and learning. But at testing time, I will assume that I don't have any task IDs, and I want to see how I can infer those tasks, the task that I'm doing currently. So I'll do it in 2 stages. I hope this is will not confuse. Our goal is to eventually go to no task IDs, but we will start with task IDs just to simplify the problem a bit. So the setup that I do this in is a collection of neuroscience tasks. They're kind of simple. I'm just like flashing the how the inputs and the outputs look like, and it'll be basically training an RNN on these tasks. There's 20 of them in this particular data set. And the idea is simple, is just we take the input and we ask the neural network to do some computation. The computation involves working memory, finding similarity, matching or finding a similar object, finding the opposite or a dissimilar object. So from the same input, you might be asked to do different responses, I think is the most important takeaway from it. So I won't get into the details of these tasks. So what I do here is simple, is I just take an RNN, and there are multiple time steps to these to each trial in these tasks, and I will train it on the correct output. Meanwhile, I'll provide it for Z, I will give it one hot encoded vectors telling it which task it's currently learning. So here I'm just providing it with the task IDs. And that just helps me set the stage for the question that I'll invite people to think about a little, so that the particular solution I will present will make sense. But this is what we have so far. We have time here, and these tasks come in. You're in a gentle regime here, where I exactly tell you, I give you a one hot encoded vector of the task that you're currently in. But after I train this neural network on all these tasks with task IDs provided, my claim then is that we'll have, by just having access to this neural network, I can now detect tasks independently. I no longer need you to provide me with task IDs. Just give me what are the computations that the input and output couples that I need to compute, and I will infer independently which task it is, and then I will provide the answer. So I don't know if, basically this is the setup, is that you have this neural network, you have X and you're supposed to map it to Y, but you cannot do that because you are trained with task ID provided. So if I don't provide you any task ID, I just give you this uniform Z, then the output will be kind of some weird average between all previous learned strategies. That is a bit nonsensical. Yeah, so I don't know if people are having any thoughts on how to infer now, how to use this neural network to infer what the task is. So I think an idea that comes to, or that came to me initially and intuitively, is to knowing that the tasks are one hot encoded, I could just try to activate this node here, basically activate this one hot encoded vector, run it through the neural network, see what response I get, and see if it matches Y or not. And if not, maybe I'll just try them serially and try all the task IDs that I have before. A problem here is that we know it's one hot encoded. What if Z was a continuous space vector or a continuous vector? Then it would be impossible to enumerate all possible solutions. So what I did was something a bit different, is to get a richer signal to help me identify what the task is. And it's through a gradient descent. So what I mean by that is I'll put Y here as a ground truth. I'll compute with a uniform Z, feed my input here, and then I'll look at the error, the difference between the ground truth, basically take the loss function, and then back propagate that through the neural network to the vector Z. And what that actually ends up doing is it gives me simultaneously, for all possible task representations, it gives me a signal whether this should be going up or this should be going down. And it's just following the gradient to tell me how to decrease my loss. And if the neural network is trained and it is trained on these tasks, then the best way to decrease the loss is to actually raise up the neuron that encodes the correct task label. So we're used to kind of backpropagation as a way to update neural networks, to update their weights and train them on tasks. But here I'm saying I'm using it to infer what the task is, to do some inference in neural space. And I will be optimizing this neural space now to adapt. So this slide's just to show that this actually works. That if I have some stream of tasks that are coming in time, demarcated by these kind of vertical colored lines, and this is the latent Z, 14 units in this case. And here, as I'm slowly optimizing Z, it retrieves the one hot encoded vector that matches the task. So if I look at my accuracy, the task changes here, my accuracy drops, but as I optimize Z, it retrieves the correct task ID, and then my accuracy goes back up again. So this optimization mechanism works to infer Z. And now kind of we've gone through the inference mechanism, but this wasn't our goal really. Here I'm giving the network the task IDs, and I'm saying I want an algorithm that discovers these things in a stream of experience. Some details here about the optimization. I really just use the PyTorch implementation of an Atom optimizer to optimize Z, but just the only difference really is optimizing in neural space rather than in connection space. So now is the second stage, and this is our goal, is I don't get any abstractions. I just get the supervised inputs and outputs tuple, and those unfold in time, and now it's up to me to cut them up. And for that, the solution is really simple, but it's a bit of a few ideas. So let me connect them on this slide. So I did mention learning as updating the weights of a neural network. And this ends up learning the task or the computation that we're interested in. And then I used backpropagation in the latent space to do latent updates, and this ends up inferring what the task is. And now my claim is that just by alternating these two, according to a simple rule here, that algorithm will end up discovering tasks in a stream of experience that are relevant to this learner, relevant to this neural network. And the way that I alternate them is simply use this accuracy-based criterion. I'm learned task A, my accuracy on task A or loss went down or accuracy went up. And I kind of monitor the statistics of this loss. And if it drops beyond some standard deviation of the variance, I'll first try to do latent updates. It's possibly a task that I've learned before and I just need to identify it. But if that fails, if that doesn't recover my accuracy, then I'll go back to weight updates. I'll then just assume that it's a new task. It's task B here. I'll learn it again. And then at some point, a switch in the environment will happen again. My accuracy will drop. I'll try to do latent updates. In this case, it is a task I've seen before. So my accuracy recovers quickly and I do not have to do. So yeah, this is pretty much how the algorithm works. And the claim is that this now can discover new tasks or discover abstractions. There are some details to it that how it works. So and it just the idea is that really backpropagation or gradient descent has the right properties and solves many of the details of getting a system like this to work. So for example, to mention one detail here, if I'm learning task A and the environment switches, if I continue to hold the same Z representation and learn task B, then task B will still also be associated with the same Z vector. And then I will overwrite what the learning in task A, known as catastrophic forgetting in neural networks. And it's a problem in continual learning that you just, anytime you update your parameters, you're overwriting previous knowledge. And this is what gets, how we end up with needing to shuffle the data carefully to kind of remove that temporal structure in the data as we train neural networks. But here I'm saying, no, let's actually use that temporal structure. We keep it, and we actually, there's a lot of information in how the environment and how the data is evolving over time. So what will happen at the end of task A, when task B comes, is gradient descent will find that actually the highest loss is to continue to assume it's the same task, that it's task A. That will become a high energy point, and you will just roll away from it as you optimize. And you will go, you haven't seen task B before, you don't know how to solve it, but you will just roll off of the hill created by task A representation. You will move Z away from the task A representation as you learn task B, and that helps protect that previous knowledge or previous learning of task A. So this is how the algorithm works when faced with 5 data sets or 5 tasks. And if I'm looking for at that plot first, or I should say that I have 5 tasks, and I'm just sequentially kind of repeating them in the same sequence. So they're just in the same order being presented here to the neural network. And these vertical colored bars are when each one of these tasks came in. I initially let the neural network kind of be pre-exposed to all of them for just to kind of get the network, the weights in the right regime and some technical details why this helps. But then here is the latent Z vector. Starting here, I will allow Z to start being inferred. So starting with this task, I follow the gradient in inferring Z, and I end up with this pattern. Another task comes in, accuracy drops, so I'll engage the inference mechanism again. Next task comes in, and backpropagation kind of retrieves this task embedding. So again, this neural network was never trained on any task IDs, was never given any task IDs. And these patterns here in Z are emerging just really due to the randomness of backpropagation or gradient descent that has not seen these tasks necessarily before, or these task identifiers. So now that we are going through these tasks, and at each accuracy drop, excuse me, we engage our inference mechanism. And you can see that initially the latent Z representations are going all over the place, although it is the same 5 tasks that we're seeing. So there is a bit of forgetting, and each time the weights are updated, this latent Z surface really changes, and those IDs change quite a lot because they are really dependent on the neural network's weight. This Z space is fully specified by the neural network weights that really compute from input to output, because each time I'm backpropagating through these weights. So as these weights change, what we see here in the Z space changes a lot, but it does not mean it's kind of as chaotic as it appears. It just means that the network is still updating its parameters, and there's learning going on. So this algorithm goes on up until a point where I start to see some motif repeating. Like I see the same pattern here, it repeats here, kind of almost starts to repeat here. Once the tasks are now consistently labeled with the same latent Z, then I know that there's less learning occurring in the neural network, and it's now adapting to these changing tasks by changing its latent. So I'll pause here to just kind of people think about how this might work. If you have any questions about how does this work, also feel free.
Ali, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
That's first of all, congrats on the iClear publication.
Oh, thanks.
um, so my question is, so how is Z connected to the RNN, like the initialization of Z?
So Z is initialized to a uniform value, and I went through some iterations of this. At first, I had Z multiplicatively adjust the gain of each neuron, and that's actually what came out in the iClear paper. But the reviewers challenged me, is like, does it have to be multiplicative? And I did try those experiments, and turns out, no, it does not actually have to be multiplicative. It just could go in as just normal context input to the neural network. So just think of it as like an additional vector of values that are providing input to the neural network. And it never changes until you update it through gradient descent.
So initially, the basic idea is that you encode all of the tasks in the RNN, and you don't care about interference because you just like sequentially encode them, right? So but nonetheless, that doesn't have a big, I mean, it has an importance, I guess. Like you probably do observe some form of interference at the very beginnings of the like 5 trial iterations, but then it does find a way to kind of represent the tasks anyways in the Z latent vector, which I guess then is simply a matter of, in a bunch of trials, you allow for orthogonalization of the representation of each tasks, right? That where basically if one of, or at least like maybe an association of activation in the Z nodes allows you to represent a specific task.
Yes, absolutely, exactly. And that interference in the beginning is quite a lot, and there's a lot of learning and forgetting. But it actually ends up being very important to allow that to happen, because sometimes when you learn the task initially, like a naive network learns the task, it might find a very trivial solution and really representations that are not reusable. So, for example, like trying to classify images of surfing versus golf, that neural network is probably just counting how many green pixels it are in each image and just making its decision based on that, just because golf you'll have grass behind you. So you discover some really non-reusable solutions, and it's important actually to allow forgetting so that these solutions are forgotten. And as the network is exposed to more tasks and it's trying to kind of squeeze them in that latent embedding, it will start to find representations that are useful across tasks. Those will be more encouraged to stay, and you will just forget the initial trivial solutions.
Cool.
So yeah, these dynamics end up being important.
All right. So just to make sure I understood, so the first part, which is sort of allowing for a sequential learning of the tasks, is actually very important. Like if you start directly by allowing for Z to kind of change given your loss function, I guess it makes it a much more unstable and slow learning pattern, right?
Oh yes, yes. It does allow. It does help to kind of allow the network to be exposed initially to these tasks.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
Without inference. I have a question in the task.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I'll read it for you. Yeah. It's fine.
Okay.
So I think it's Valentin Barrière. Yes. So he says, is it possible to find the optimal order for the sequence of tasks using this method? For instance, in order to improve the learning kind of curriculum learning.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's actually, there is still probably some work to be done to really optimize this. But it does allow the network to kind of. So what I like about this, and in term is the curriculum is driven by the neural network. The neural network kind of decides what is hard and what is not hard, what is conflicted and not conflicted. By having this accuracy-based metric, If the accuracy drops after learning a task and you go back to the task you were doing before, if there was a lot of forgetting, then the accuracy will drop and will trigger this this inference. If the tasks are just compatible with each other, you will just go through them. You will not do any learning at all. So, excuse me. So in a way, we are allowing the neural network to tell us which task it needs to learn first. If there was error, it will learn. It's much different than engaging the learning mechanisms at all time. If you engage learning at all times, even if you will have forgetting needlessly, really, like your accuracy is reasonable on this current task, or what's left is just noise that you really cannot predict. But this continued learning ends up creating a lot of forgetting and interference. So in a way, I am presenting the tasks to the network, but it's not learning necessarily the entire time. It's depending on its accuracy, it chooses when to learn and in which order, and what still needs learned or not. So if I probably look at which trials end up, or which batches end up learning, needing, engaging the weight updates, then there is probably a curriculum in there. So yeah, I think your intuition is correct. So now we have a cognitive control structure. We haven't only just learned these tasks. We learned these tasks and we learned an abstraction over them. And I'm going to go back again to the promise from cognitive psychology that now we were this is supposed to allow us to generalize the new tasks. But I'll first just kind of take a quick look at, are those latent embeddings that we're learning meaningful? And because people probably do not, actually this is quantification, but it's really is the same example that I've shown, so I'll not go through it. So one thing I did notice, if I look at the Z that actually ends up solving these tasks, and this simulation has 10 tasks rather than 5, to kind of allow for a bit of richness. And I do see that networks that, for example, have the anti-component, just a sub-computation in these tasks, do end up clustering together. So it is kind of finding some meaningful clustering. If I do a t-SNE plot of these latent Z vectors, I do see clusters in them where tasks that are similar end up clustering close together, and tasks that are conflicted end up being far apart. So these representations are useful, but now to kind of make it into to really kind of study what are the benefits, went to machine learning benchmarks, and this is kind of coming from the continual learning domain, where this one of the benchmarks is to use the MNIST digits. We create 5 pairs that are just arbitrarily chosen. And it's each pair becomes a task, and we have to arbitrarily classify the digits in this pair as first class or second class, and those are just randomly chosen, really. But now we have tasks of telling these 2 images apart, and the idea in continual learning is to go through learning them in blocks or as a sequential experience. And the hope is that by the time you learn task 4, task 5, you haven't forgotten task A or task 1 and 2 is the idea behind continual learning. And if I run this algorithm, Thalamus, on these benchmarks, if it does quite well. It's able to learn these tasks sequentially, label them as it goes, and by controlling how far or similar the labels are, it's able to kind of limit forgetting. But then I think what really stands out about this algorithm is, and this is not a fair comparison, I have to say, to these other algorithms, but I'll go through it because I think it does highlight the generalization part in this algorithm. So like I said, typically in continual learning setting, we're plotting the task accuracy of the first one. As we are learning task 1, 2, all the way to 5, we're hoping that the accuracy in task 1 does not drop. But here, I'm not actually plotting that. I'm plotting the last task accuracy, the accuracy on task 5. But the thing is, I'm learning task 1, 2, and 3. I have not trained on task 5 just yet. So there's no way for this neural network to solve task 5, and all other continual learning algorithms are just scoring at a chance level. And of course, because they're not designed to handle these situations. Whereas Thalamus, but training on task 3 and 4, it has already built up some rich Z abstractions and some rich Z surface that now I could take a pair from task 5, which I haven't updated my weights on, and just by composing and recombining the Z vector, I can already solve task 5. So it just shows that those embeddings or the information of that in the embedding can now be composed to solve tasks that have not been seen before. So this is doesn't really fit with few shot and zero shot and that, but I would say it is the closest to few shot learning, or one shot maybe, because I need a pair from task 5 to update Z. Then I could solve other samples from task 5, but I never had to update the weights for task 5. So I guess the cognitive psychology promise is true, that these class of architectures does generalize, is my takeaway from that. So the next part now, like I did these neuroscience tasks, we did benchmarks on MNIST, but I really kind of want to take this to become a useful tool in machine learning. So the follow-up study was kind of a simple setting. I think language models have really impressed us with their recent success, and I think language is the ultimate sequence that you have to, and you can cut it up in many interesting ways. I mean, a paragraph, you can cut it up into sentences. You can decide if the topics are changing, the intention of the speaker. There are just many abstractions involving perception and generation of language. So I did want to take it in that direction. And here I'll show a simple experiment to show possibly the benefits of bringing these cognitive architectures into machine learning. What I did here is I trained an RNN as a language model on 3 data sets, data set A, B, and C. And in this case, they were taking from Baby LM challenge, where they gathered 10 data sets that a typical child hears during development, to really, and with the goal of how can we efficiently learn from very little data. What I do here is I train the network on those 3 data sets. And that's if I'll actually go ahead and start talking about the results. This is an LSTM with no context. So basically this is just an LSTM trained on shuffled data from all these 3 data sets. And I get a training loss with some speed. But then I do a very simple change. And now I provide the network with an additional input, a one-hot encoded vector that just has the ID, the identifier of the data set. So it's 3 data sets and 3 identifiers. And by doing something as simple as that, just telling what the network which data set it's learning currently, I see a modest but like really easy to obtain decrease in the training loss. So now this LSTM with context is training faster. So again, from cognitive psychology, they say that cutting up our computational space should speed learning. And I was kind of happy to see this actually panning out in training neural networks. And this is not just memorization, also the testing loss also decreases with the same amount. So this is, yeah, like very cheap. Just the data set identifier, and now I have better training. But then that creates a problem for a language model that I am now dependent on you providing me the task ID. Like, great, okay, I learn faster, but I'm dependent on the task ID. And the idea is simple. I'll use my trick from before. So given, for example, some paragraph or a sentence from one of these data sets, I'll feed it through the neural network, and I will use gradient descent to infer which task ID it is. And here I show that how many numbers of words do I need as evidence, and my accuracy in identifying the data set. So you can see that it really requires 1 or 2 words, I don't know, depending on what accuracy is acceptable, to infer which data set we're in, again, using the same inference mechanism, gradient descent. So this shows me now that, no, indeed, I'm not dependent. I can infer the abstractions necessary. But now, I want to, again, take it to the generalization piece and consider adding a 4th data set now to the mix. So I will train on data set A, B, and C. In this case, it's Wikipedia, children's stories, and movie subtitles. And these are actual data sets from the collection that I'm using. And then I get science fiction novels. And I just want to see how my model does on this data set. So an LSTM with no context will actually, like here, it has a loss of 6.8. Whereas the LSTM with context that is dependent on context being provided will score a higher loss initially. It'll do worse on predicting sentences from this new data set. But as I optimize Z, and I iteratively optimize it with each step, basically inferring what the right Z is, backpropagation will compose the identifiers of the data sets that I've seen so far, and will now give me a lower loss on this new data set that I have not seen before. So now it's able to generalize and adapt its representations to solve new tasks without having to do any learning. So this is kind of just preliminary work. I mean, dataset identifier is a very, very crude context to follow. But I'm just here at this stage happy that these intuitions actually pan out in training a language model. What I really would like to do next is to find something even more meaningful. So there's this large literature in human event cognition as to how do people cut up the world exactly. So in this experiment, people are listening to a story, and human participants are asked to press a button every time they feel that some interesting or some new event ended and another event is going to happen. So of course the instruction is a bit vague, but it's just to encourage people to show all kinds of behaviors of how do they segment their experience of language. And it turns out that if you ask GPT-3 to do the same, describe the task to GPT-3, It will also give you some segmentation that is very, very good and very close to how humans segment the story as they listen to it. So the idea would be now, like, I'll take these segmentations that humans and GPT agree on as my context signals. Like, these will become the granularity of how I'm going to cut up the experience, and I will train a neural network. It can infer them back. We can organize these hierarchically so that there is very granular context up down at the bottom and very abstract concepts up in the top. And with what I hope I convince you that this will lead to training faster with less data. So I'm hoping that that could be a potential solution to the data efficiency problems that large language models are facing right now. So yeah, I hope I convince you that feedback control has the right properties, that it respects it infers based on what the weights of the neural networks are. It identifies learned tasks, composes solutions to new tasks, and also has the ability to create new labels for tasks it hasn't seen before. And it really seems to have the right properties. And as a summary, yeah, alternating learning and inference is a simple mechanism to discover cognitive structures. We are seeing the cognitive control structure benefits manifest in training neural networks with transfer learning, few-shot learning, generalization, continual learning. And in the future, yeah, I would hope to now replace gradient or backpropagation with another learned network that basically learns them to give me the gradients without having to use backpropagation. And I believe this maps to the cerebellum in the brain. And then the other future work is what I shared so far, and kind of discovering events and abstractions in linguistic data to obtain higher data efficiency. With that, thank you for having me present our work to you, and a list of people that I'm thankful for, starting with Robert Yang at MIT and other collaborators on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. That was great. I'm happy to see how this work has been unfolding and successfully on top of that. So that's great. I don't know if there's questions here or on the chat. So on the chat, you can also just, Julio, you can just ask your question or if you want me to read it, but go ahead if you want. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, great presentation. Thanks. I really like the methods and the result of figure 7. I mean, like really got on the point of this idea of transfer learning and this forward transfer of applying continual learning. So yeah, really thank you about that. One question that I have is right now, I mean, MNIS and probably the other data set that you use are really like easy in the way of that we don't expect the model to forget that much. How do you expect that these kind of methods behave when we're training more complex data sets, when the distribution between tasks change like a lot or more than this kind of data set that you use? Do you expect that the models behave like well to reuse this information, or how do you expect to reuse something that is not normally reusable? I don't know.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, very good question. And I struggle with this a lot because I think so So people do continual learning sometimes, for example, let's say on ImageNet, that you take ImageNet pictures and you kind of make them into a pairwise comparison, and say like it's more complex and it's more challenging. But it's really, I struggle with it because I feel like it's almost the wrong question to ask. I don't think that pairwise comparison on ImageNet is an interesting way to learn about the world, because a lot of the solutions could be very trivial if you look at it as just pairwise comparisons. Like I mentioned the golf and surfing example. I think the solution to ImageNet is solution that the solution that is interesting is the solution that really can recognize all images, because that has to really learn meaningful things about the world. So I really kind of stopped pursuing continual learning because of that. So I haven't, yeah, I mean, you have a similar intuition that sometimes things do not transfer as much between the tasks that you're learning. And in that setting, I feel like, yeah, this wouldn't be the best way to solve it. I think it'll work well, but I feel like all this forgetting and interference between the tasks, I think the interference is inherently allows you to find shared knowledge and transferable knowledge by letting these tasks and collide and interact. Then you kind of hone in on that shared knowledge. But if there's not much shared knowledge to begin with, I feel like they should just be mapped to the same network, so that you actually end up learning some interesting representations in the aggregate. I know this might not be the clearest, but yeah, I think each data set has very, very particular situation to what would be interesting to do in it. Yeah, very cool question.
What is the impact in terms of computation? And for example, if you want to train a BERT model on a big corpus, or fine tune a large language model on different topics, something like that.
Oh yeah, that's a very great question as well. In this iClear paper, I do optimize like 200 optimization steps to infer Z. So that's 200 runs through the model. It's quite inefficient. But now, like being unhappy with this, I actually found a way how just like need one run through the model, and I'll be able to identify the task immediately. So so with this now new tool, now I could say it's efficient. But yeah, you're right. Before I couldn't say that. And so now what I need is like one forward pass through the BERT, and then one backward pass. I'll be able to tell what is the context, like what is the intent of the user, who am I talking to, or what is expected. And then I need another forward run through the model, but now with this updated context signals. So instead of one run, yeah, I'm asking for 2 forward runs and 1 backward run, which, yeah, seems reasonable considering that I think next, for example, I mean, maybe I showed that it learns faster and it can generalize to new situations. So by cutting up context, you can generalize to things you haven't seen before by composing contextual signals. But now I'm starting to see that you can also compute uncertainty, for example. If you're trying to infer the intent of the user and you find many, like the gradients given by backpropagation are just very flat across the board, then maybe you know to ask next, clarify the intent of the user. So you can have now levels of uncertainty as well that are at a more abstract space. So I'm hoping I do need to throw in more to justify the 3-4 runs into the model instead of one? Yeah, very cool question.
Cool. I have a bunch of questions, but maybe I guess the first one that comes in my mind is Ali, this kind of the sensitivity in the event segmentation, right? So by that I mean, for instance, and also thinking about the scalability of this algorithm. So if I have something like learning like to play tennis, right? And then I can probably think of another sports that's very similar in many of its say properties, which is maybe badminton or table tennis, something like that, right? In terms of actions, I mean, right? And if I would learn, so if I would play tennis, and then now you change the task or the sport, and now it's becoming badminton. Obviously there's a lot of like visual inputs that are completely different, but we are at the end of the day action machines, right, as humans. And I would do actually actions that are very, very similar, right? So maybe the loss is not going to drop down very, very drastically, right? And I might not be able to say like, well, maybe this is a different task or not, right? But I do want to categorize it as a different task as well, right? But not fully a different task, right? I want some overlap between these things, right? So I was thinking on, is there maybe, or have you been thinking about event segmentation that kind of incorporates that idea, right? So in the sense that it's not a completely different task, it's just a mixture of a little bit of that task and then maybe a new one, right? Which in a way your latent Z vector does. But I was thinking like, so what do you think about this idea of like maybe not pushing it to like a hardcore threshold segmentation thing about like, well, if my loss goes down to a certain level, then I create this novel task, or I allow for a say a Z activation to kind of transition. Because, and I ask you that because we've been doing that with actually with Matt and Dan, right? So we use entropy in that sense, right? We don't use a loss, we use sort of the activation in the thalamus layer in our network, that when it kind of, you know, reaches a certain level of entropy, then you have this attractor state switch. So I was thinking like, what do you think about that?
Oh, that's actually great. I never knew that. Yeah, you used that. But I agree. I feel like that's where actually the segmentation should happen, is in the abstract space. If the abstract space needs changed, then the gradients will tell you, or you get to know at that level, and that way you're not kind of having to put all these metrics on your accuracy, and who knows how do you define your accuracy in badminton. I don't know, like you know, you move faster, you move slower, like they're in typical inward scenarios, you don't have that kind of information necessarily. So yeah, but the abstract space, if it doesn't fit your current experience anymore, it will have strong error signals in the abstract space. And then you can put a threshold there. So it's kind of funny. Okay, no, you were ahead of me and thinking about that. So I agree. It should be some measure in the abstract space that helps you segment. And
then,
that way, if tasks are similar, then you're fine. Then you don't get any error.
Yeah, we were like toying around with some form of you know, catch representation of the abstract space and comparing it to the current representation, stuff like that. And then basically like almost using like some form of KL divergence or like an entropy measure that allows you to kind of, you know, create the event segmentation. Cool. And so the other question I had was, so I guess one key feature of your work here is this alternation between inference and learning, and I was wondering how, or if so, how unstable it would be if you're trying to like push both things together. Does it work if you don't alternate? Is there a way of doing that?
Oh yeah, very interesting. I really had to investigate that. In extremely simple scenarios, you could run both at the same time and you'll be fine. But as soon as the task complexity and the numbers task starts to increase, then no, interestingly, you have to be very judicious in terms of when to engage task inference. I can think of it as like you're trying to infer the task, but you're trying to learn the task at the same time. So it's like both become moving targets for each other, and you just never end up stable, like have a stable learning of this task with this embedding, and it just becomes associated with it. And next time you see the task, you infer that embedding. If you just continuously move the two pieces, then no, you diverge. The algorithm does not converge anymore.
Cool. And then maybe, and I'm sorry, just because this is very interesting, I have my last question. So I was wondering about, so right now the sort of the latent representation you have in Z, and also associated to Mike Halassa's work, and is the idea that obviously you kind of represent context, right? But there's also all of this bulk about, you know, the PFC representing abstract structure that might be also, you know, coming into the basal ganglia to get to, like, in feedback loops to guide how information processing is behaving, right?
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you're thinking about having, instead of just like a flat vector, so to speak, something more hierarchical at that level. And I, by that I mean that, for instance, right now in this context, you're kind of associating, you can recombine information of specific tasks, right, to understand a novel task, but you have to take almost the entire task with it, so to speak, right? And maybe with a hierarchical representation in that Z factor, you can kind of do real, so to speak, compositional learning, in the sense that you take building blocks of specific tasks. And I was wondering what you think about that, and if it's something that it's worth, you know, pursuing.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely fascinating to have a richer task embedding, and hierarchical is definitely on the top of the list. And yeah, the hope will be that your abstractions are organized, and then that will lead to even richer forms of compositionality and segmentation. So no, I absolutely agree. Now, how to implement that exactly? I feel like there's so many different ways, and I'm still kind of trying to find one way that is kind of parsimonious, kind of minimal assumptions, and that is easy to infer. Because hierarchical structures are very hard to run inference on. You probably know. But you know, is like, do you make the change at this level or at that level, or where's the level of the error? And if you make changes here, then everything down there changes. So just the inference is very like you need really second order gradients if you really want to do it accurately, rather. So yeah, but no, I of course, yeah, that's absolutely is a wonderful way to kind of move forward with this, is to create something hierarchical.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ali, again, for this really awesome presentation, and thanks everybody for attending. I'll definitely shoot you an email. Actually, Julio Hurtado, who asked you the first question, is also working on this type, you know, of continual learning work, and they just come up with also a student of the center, with sort of maybe a novel paradigm that even further tests this form of catastrophic forgetting, which I think maybe your model could be interesting to test on.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, we should definitely set up a meeting. All right, cool. Thanks a lot.
All right. Okay. Thank you for having me, and thanks for the great questions.